Welcome to the second lecture in the Chapter 7 series. In this lecture, we are going to be talking about effective listening. So in the first lecture on this chapter, we talked about what listening was, how it was different from hearing, and some different listening styles, ways, and reasons, types for why we listen. And in this lecture, we are going to be talking about how we can become better listeners, how we can listen more effectively, and what are some barriers that may prevent us from engaging in active and effective listening in our interpersonal relationships. Before we get started with some of the content in the meat and bones of this chapter, I want you to think about and answer these two questions. What or who do you think is a good listener? And what are some verbal and nonverbal behaviors that they display when they're listening to you that lead you to make that statement or that assessment that they are a good listener? And similarly, what about a bad listener? Do the same kind of exercise for that. Okay, so as we think about effective listening, let's think about the definition of what it means to listen effectively. Your chapter defined effective listening as listening with a conscious mind and having the explicit goal of understanding what the other person is trying to communicate to you. So this really involves two important things: being able to set aside distraction and have this kind of conscious effort, this active effort in terms of engaging in that process, as well as having the goal of really trying to understand what the other person is saying to you. So really tying back to those beginning models of communication that we talked about, when we talked about decoding, really talked about assigning meaning, beginning to understand the messages that are being transmitted in that interaction. And this is really where we see effective listening coming into play. When we talk about effective listening, your chapter presents and the literature really highlights what we call the Hurrier model of listening. And the Hurrier model of listening has 6 important stages. The first stage ties back to some of what we talked about in the first lecture, and this is the physiological process of hearing the message. So in order to engage in that conscious, active effort to assign meaning, we have to first start with the biscuit. We have to hear that what the person is saying to us, that physical process of perceiving sound. We can't understand, we can't interpret, we can't evaluate if we've never heard the message that's being communicated to us. The second is understanding. So we must comprehend the meaning of the words, the phrases that we're hearing. A barrier to this, so when we may not understand a message, is when somebody maybe is speaking a language that we don't understand, so maybe a foreign language. We may have a barrier to listening in the second stage if somebody is using technical jargons. We talked a little bit about technical jargon and slang in the language chapter, and so those things really come back into play here. So if we may hear the message, but if somebody's using a language that we don't are fluent in, then we would have this hiccup. We'd have a barrier here at understanding. We wouldn't be able to understand what they're saying. The third stage is remembering. So this is a very sometimes unconscious, a very cognitive effort here. The process of storing information in our memory and being able to retrieve it when necessary. We remember things that we've heard previously that help us kind of relate and communicate to others in a relationship. We know information about the context because of this third stage of memory. So being able to recall and remember past information, that's really going to help us attribute meaning and assign meaning and understand what the other person is saying as part of that listening process. So here we really get that, we're really getting into the assigning meaning part in the third stage. Interpreting, so thinking about being able to pay attention to and assign meaning to the messages that the person is saying. So really getting into that decoding piece of the puzzle here, being able to interpret, understand what the person is trying to say. The fifth stage is evaluating, so being able to not just interpret what the other person is saying and assign meaning to it, but here we're really judging whether the statements are accurate. This is where we would begin to separate facts from opinions, where we determine if what the other person's saying is appropriate, using the context to help evaluate and shape the meaning. So really begin to evaluate. Then we have the sixth stage, which is feedback. So we have to then respond. We saw this in the feedback models as well. So we've talked a little bit about some barriers to kind of this process, these stages. If somebody's speaking a foreign language, that would prevent us from understanding. We know that some barriers to hearing could be if there's noise in the environment, so tying back to the basic model of communication here as well. And then in the sixth stage of responding, we get the feedback loop coming into play, right? So then we are transitioning out of receiving, interpreting, and evaluating the message, and we begin to process and encode the message to give some sort of response feedback stage. So this process, the HURIER model, really does tie back into some of what we've already talked about in those models of communication from before. So when we think about listening in general, we know that we are not always super effective listeners. We have things that come into play with our environment. We have things that come into play with our own kind of thoughts and feelings that may prevent us from really being able to either devote the conscious mind, the effort to the listening process, or that prevent us from being able to understand the meaning or map out what pieces of the context are important. And so we would call these things, and I've grouped them in a very two distinct buckets, categories, but essentially they're barriers to listening. So there are things that prevent us from being an effective listener, barriers. And there are two categories that we can use to divide the common barriers to listening. So I'm going to talk about some of the common barriers. These aren't the only barriers. We could definitely come up with more than what's in this list. But we have what I've termed kind of contextual and cognitive barriers to listening. Contextual barriers to listening really go back to the noise that we experience in our environment. So you have this word context in there, and that's really what we're referring to. Any instances where there would be a difficult listening situation. So if we think about if there's a loud noise in the environment that makes it hard to listen to, if there are distractions in the environment. So, when you're at a restaurant, maybe there's TV on, a sports game or something, you might be distracted and not really listening to other people at your table. Sometimes the conversation next to you is more interesting, or there's something else, maybe a couple people at a table over are having a fight, right? So there are distractions in our environment that can prevent us from really being able to pay attention to the conversation that we are actually a part of. We also have instances where sometimes the topic is uninteresting. So maybe the person who you're speaking to, they are talking about something that's uninteresting to you, maybe something that they've talked about over and over and over again, or maybe it's a topic that you just don't really care about. Maybe you're at a presentation, large lecture presentation, because you've been forced to go for a class or something, and that topic just really isn't interesting to you. In those cases, you may find it really hard to kind of pay attention and really give it the active mind necessary to engage in the effective listening process, because you're just not really interested in what the other person is saying. So these three things really make up the contextual barriers to listening, the pieces that kind of are made up of and relate to the situation that we are communicating in. The next bucket is the cognitive barriers to listening. So thinking about what's going on inside our own selves that may prevent us from being able to actively attend to the messages that people are sending our way. The first is information overload. So we know that sometimes we are in listening situations where we are getting a lot of information. I know that sometimes, when I go to conferences, I'm attending a lot of sessions, I'm getting a lot of new information. By the end of the day, I'm just tapped out. I just have a really hard time paying attention to really what anybody else is saying. You get this sometimes, if you think back to when you were coming to the university for the first time, you had that orientation week and you're given all of this information about your dorm and classes and your food plan and what the code of conduct is and where the library is, right? You get all this information and, it's hard to even remember and recall what the resources are that are available to you. And at the end of those days, you're really, you're tired, your just brain kind of hurts. You're so tired of getting new information and that you're experiencing this information overload. And that tiredness makes it really hard to really process and actively attend to new information. So again, you can see that it's a really cognitive process, something that's going on inside yourself. We can sometimes glaze over. So sometimes when there is an uninteresting topic, like a contextual barrier, we then also experience a cognitive barrier. So glazing over happens when our minds tend to think faster than our brains, and we can, engage in kind of daydreaming. So really thinking about that daydreaming process that can happen when we're listening and the person we're thinking faster than the person is talking. That's what I meant to say earlier. So we're really processing the information faster than we're receiving the message. So sometimes in those situations we tend to daydream, and then it's hard to come back out of that daydreaming situation. When the other person is done speaking, maybe they want you to respond and give feedback. We know that, and we'll talk more about this in the last half of the session, that sometimes our biases and our prejudice can come into play through perceptual filters that can prevent us from really hearing fully and appropriately attributing aspects of the context to the messages. And so we see this a lot when we talk about, in political conversations. Maybe you've had some of these lately, either face-to-face or on Facebook, maybe, and you went home for Christmas in your family relationships, and the other person, you could tell they're just really not listening. They're not perspective taking because they're so clouded by their own bias, by their own prejudice, and their own worldviews, that they're really not attending to your messages, to your arguments that you're presenting. Sometimes when we are communicating in those similar situations, we see people engage in the rebuttal tendency. And the rebuttal tendency is the tendency to disrupt a debate, disrupt in order to debate the speaker's point. In this sense, you are already formulating your own reply while the other person is still talking, and you've stopped listening to what they're saying. This is related to the concept of closed-mindedness, where you're refusing to consider kind of what the other person may be thinking or communicating. That closed-mindedness was a concept from your chapter. So the rebuttal tendency is really just butting in, cutting the other person off, or even just stopping the listening process early because you are formulating what you're going to say next. This is different than competitive interrupting. Competitive interrupting occurs when somebody constantly interrupts to dominate the conversation. So they may even do something as simple as like trying to finish your sentence for you, or interrupting with interjecting their own kind of experience or thoughts about the issue. And it's not just once or twice, but it's constant. It becomes a really repetitive thing. And that really prevents kind of they're not listening really to everything that you have to say, because perhaps they're engaging in the rebuttal tendency by stopping their listening process to formulate their response, but they're going even further. They're interjecting, they're stopping the speaker by interrupting them to interject their own ideas. And then finally, we have pseudo-listening. And pseudo-listening is essentially like fake listening. Students sometimes do this in class. I know sometimes I do this at a conference. I'll be giving those nonverbal feedback cues that I'm listening, right? I'll nod my head along, maybe even provide eye contact. I might even pretend like I'm writing things down on a piece of paper. Maybe I'm making a grocery list, or I'm just doodling in my notebook. I'm giving all of the cues that I'm engaged and actively listening, but I may be glazing over instead. I may be daydreaming. I'm thinking about other things. I'm not actually attending to the other person's message. And so pseudo listening is unique in that you are not really actively listening to what the other person has to say, but you are pretending that you are. So you're giving those feedback cues, those nonverbal cues that you are active, that you are engaged. And it's really only when maybe somebody asks you a direct question or asks you to paraphrase what they said that you then are caught up. You're like, oh, maybe I wasn't actually listening. Sometimes we do this so well that we fool ourselves. And so thinking about overcoming these barriers being really important to being that really active, conscious, effective listener that we had in our definition for today. So this wraps up the content for the first half of the semester. This wraps up the lectures for the first half of the semester. Now you are ready, if you've completed all of the previous lectures, you've completed the activities and the class discussions, you are ready to take your first exam. And the first exam is in the exam folder. You will have all the instructions are in the exam. It'll be timed. You'll have 50 questions, 2 points each for 100 points. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to email me.